So I'm Libby Weber. I'm very grateful that STR gave me the opportunity to get to interview Nicolai Foss, who has been a fairly long time co-author for me, as well as a mentor in this field. So thank you again for that wonderful opportunity. I've actually learned a lot about him that I didn't know, which is fascinating to me.
You'll learn more, I think.
Great. So I'm going to do a brief introduction before we get started asking questions for him. Whoops. There we go. So just a few of his selected accomplishments. There are many, many more that we'll be discussing likely today. So he got his PhD in 1993 from CBS. And has spent 22 years there. He started out from assistant to associate and went to full. Then he went to Bocconi for a couple of years, and now he's back at CBS again.
Sorry to interrupt, Libby. We're not seeing the second slide.
Oh, okay. Let me try to share again.
Thank you.
Are you seeing it now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So he's published over 224 articles in review journals, 102 book chapters, 26 books, and many other things. These numbers might not even be accurate, right? This was taken off of his CBS bio, and they're changing all the time. He's just incredibly productive. He has, as of yesterday, 41,496 citations in Google Scholar, and has been recognized as being an incredibly highly cited researcher by several institutions. He's a member of Academia Europea and a fellow of Strategic Management Society. He was also the 2020 chairperson of the Behavioral Strategy Interest Group, and he's a knight. Knighted by Denmark, which we're going to talk about because that's pretty cool. So with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing so that you can focus on Nicolai. And I'm going to start by asking you, what's the story about how you ended up in academia?
Well, I like the way you put it, ended up. Sounds like washing onto the shore of some remote island, which is, you know, probably a good metaphor anyway, but I don't think there's a particular story. I was an economics student at the University of Copenhagen. I'm not very serious about it, I guess. But then suddenly, the third year of my bachelor program, I developed this very strong fascination with certain parts of macroeconomics, more specifically something called new classical macroeconomics. And I got fascinated by all the debate and the conflict and the shouting and so on. It was very exciting. And then a little bit later, I got into the whole debate about the microfoundations of macroeconomics, which was very, very important at that time. So we were talking late 1980s here. Then a few years later, I wrote a master's thesis, which got the top grade. And my advisor asked me if I was interested in becoming an economics PhD student. And of course I was, and I got enrolled in the program, and I actually was an economics PhD student for 9 months until they ran out of money. They just didn't have any money left for me, and so I was on the market, but then I was very quickly hired by the Copenhagen Business School. This was in 1989, I think, November. So I arrived at CBS, which was a super small, very provincial outfit back then. Almost no research culture. Of course, that has changed a lot since, because CBS is this, Copenhagen Business School is this massive behemoth almost, with a lot of research now. But as you also said, I've had most of my career there, except those almost 4 years at Bocconi.
So
that's a story, basically, of how I ended up.
Oh, I'm sorry?
That's the story. That's a story.
So did I hear you correctly? You were in a PhD program for 9 months. Is that what you just said?
Yeah. They didn't have any money left. So,
so I was going to ask you to give advice, if you could go back and give advice to yourself as a PhD student, what would that be? But perhaps since you've only been in a program for 9 months, maybe we could ask to give you advice to PhD students today.
I was in an economics PhD program for 9 months. Then I changed basically to something like a program in management. But you know, Europe in you really have literally no idea of what Europe in the early 1990s was like in terms of doctoral education. The way it worked was that you were given 3 years, very generous pay, and no one basically cared much about what you were doing. Zero coursework, no PhD courses. I've taken 1 PhD course in my career, that's all. So quite predictably, most of those who were in the program had difficulties choosing a topic, and almost no one finished in time. There was very, very little mentoring. Most faculty didn't publish, many didn't have PhD degrees. It was super loose. That too has changed a lot since then. So, you know, I think many, particularly in the US, have difficulties understanding how, in many ways, how backwards it really was back in the 1990s and perhaps even early 2000s in Europe.
So with very little mentorship, then how did you decide on your dissertation topic?
Well, as you can get, I had almost complete freedom. So what I did was I wrote 7 or perhaps 8, I've forgotten the exact number, but 7 or 8 essays on various things loosely connected by, you know, the theory of the firm. And of course, I wrote them all in Danish. This was 1992. That's the year I handed my thesis in. All of these papers got published eventually, but of course only after I translated them into English. But I wrote it all in Danish. Yes, that's crazy.
So who would you say were early influences on your work?
Yeah, so when I was an economics student, I read people like Schumpeter, Israel Kirzner. I was interested in entrepreneurship, Friedrich Hayek, Axel Leijonhufvud. I guess these were my initial influences. I had an advisor, Christian Knudsen, who didn't publish much, or really didn't publish much in the journals at least, but he was extremely well connected. So he would bring in people like Richard Langlois and Sid Winder. They became very important influences. There was an English economist, Brian Lowsby, who was a huge initial influence on me. Another early influence was a Scottish economist, George Richardson, a fantastic but neglected thinker. Richardson had left academia in the early 1970s because he felt no one really paid any attention to his ideas. So he became the chief executive of Oxford University Press and I think the chairman of the board of directors of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a really big person in the whole Oxford community. And then he decided to re-enter academia and make contact with me, and we exchanged a lot of ideas and viewpoints and so on. George actually suggested that I absolutely must leave academia, get a real and more prosperous life, you know, as an executive or something. So that was George Richardson. Then Oliver Williamson, I also met him relatively early, mid-1990s. And he's maybe my single greatest influence. I think the basic perspective I still work from, is fundamentally a transaction cost economics perspective. I'm also a huge fan of people like Harold Demsetz, Armin Alshan, Stephen Chung, the whole economic property rights approach. You know, scholars who manage to use basic economic tools in a highly intelligent way to really, really illuminate the way the real world works in a non-trivial manner. You know, I continue to be amazed at the power of basic price theory and microeconomics to do these things, illuminate and make the workings of the world comprehensible to us. I think there's more. I was also involved in something called Druid that many of you probably have heard of. You may have been to the Druid conferences. I was one of the founders of Druid. I think that was 95 or 96. So I got into the whole European evolutionary economics scene, which was very big in the 1990s. Late 1990, I met people like Jay Barney, Bjørn Wernerfeldt, who is Danish, Cynthia Montgomery. You know, I also met Dan Leventhal, Dick Rumels, John Hannan, Howard Aldrich. So while I was still a PhD student or very young faculty, what else is there? I corresponded with, this was back in the day when you would still write letters. I corresponded with Jim March, who tried to convince me to come to Stanford to do a PhD with him. So I was very, very lucky and privileged to get in contact with very important elite people in the field at a very early stage of my career. That of course was a tremendous inspiration. So we're still talking the mid-1990s. Yeah.
So you're known for a lot of your work. You mentioned evolutionary economics, you mentioned TCE, but one of the things that people typically associate you with is the Microfoundations view. And so can you tell us a little bit about how that research stream came about?
Right. So I mentioned already that as a student, I was very interested in the microfoundations of macroeconomics. So the whole microfoundations debate is basically a long-standing debate in economics. And I very vividly remember being very puzzled when I was taught macroeconomics about the sort of the status of all that macroeconomics talk. We had the big I, the capital I investments, and there was a capital Y, total production, and there was some kind of functional relation between them. But I was puzzling over how is that relation? What is in that functional specification? Where are the microfoundations? And that's really one of the reasons why I took an interest in the work of people like Hayek, who I mentioned earlier, Leyenhufvud, Ludwig Lachmann, and so on, because these people were all about microfoundations, and they were skeptical of macroeconomics, particularly because they saw that macroeconomics didn't have strong microfoundations. So then I met in 2003 or 4 Teppo Filin, and Teppo and I discussed the microfoundations theme a great deal, and then we wrote up our 2005 essay and got published in Strategic Organization, and that might have been the opening salvo in the Microfoundations project. I personally, I never thought it was a big deal because it's a traditional, long-standing debate in economics that, in a sense, was just transferred to a management context. So I was a little bit surprised that the whole Microfoundations thing became pretty influential, which it did.
So on that note, do you think that Strategic Management Society would actually even have a behavioral strategy interest group if not for your introduction of Microfoundations to the field?
I think so, because behavioral strategy was defined as a subfield in 2011 when Tom Powell and his co-authors published that special issue in Strategic Management Journal on behavioral strategy. But of course, psychology ideas have been used in strategy for much longer time. So yeah, I guess there would have been a behavioral strategy subfield, but I think even in behavioral strategy, we may still have a problem with microfoundations, because a lot of what passes as behavioral strategy isn't necessarily particularly microfoundational. Organizational cognition stuff, parts of the behavioral theory of the firm. It's not always that clear where the microfoundations actually are.
So do you see then a big opportunity for researchers to actually dig into microfoundations in that behavioral strategy field? I do. There's a lot to do here. So in terms of what may be the next frontiers in behavioral strategy, I think one very, very important issue that we need to be much more serious about is radical or deep or Nietzschean uncertainty or even ignorance. We all recognize that uncertainty that goes beyond probabilistic risk is important, but we try to get around it with various probabilistic tools. So we talk about ambiguity, and when we get formal about ambiguity, try to formalize it. We talk about decision makers not knowing which probability distribution actually describes or is relevant, and that's ambiguity. Or we may talk about probability intervals, or we may go all Bayesian, but it's all probabilistic. It doesn't get around or get to the
to get to the heart of the matter of Tce uncertainty. The whole heuristics and biases program, which is so super important in behavioral strategy, is also, at the end of the day, it's also fundamentally probabilistic. So, of course, we have notions of sense making, which is going very much in the right direction, building models to comprehend and make sense of an uncertain future. But again, we don't know much about how we construct these models, how we actually engage in sense making. What are the beliefs that we decide to accept? What are the beliefs that we discard when we sense make? Do we need to have coherent beliefs necessarily? You know, there are lots of things that have to do with beliefs and belief formation dynamics that we know extremely little about. These are things that I'm exploring at the moment with my postdoc Timo Elik. So I think this is truly a major issue, really a frontier issue. Another one, which is very relevant, given that you're interviewing me, is what you may call behavioral organization design, or even behavioral transaction cost economics. So what happens to contractual outcomes? What happens to governance outcomes if we take cognitive psychology, motivational psychology, social psychology much more seriously than we have done in the organizational design field, and certainly in transaction cost economics? So I would think of your work in this respect as very much the frontier stuff, along with work by Jackson Nicholson, Kyle Mayer, and so on. My co-author Ambra Mazzelli says that distributed cognition in organizations, and not just in the upper echelons, but all over the organization, as it were, is very important and neglected, and she's probably right. But now we're doing a Zoom meeting, and I'm thinking we have all these Zoom meetings, and we can transcribe a lot of what's going on, and it's a fantastic data. Potentially, it's the opportunity of fantastic data sets, isn't it? If we can transcribe and do something with all these massive amounts of texts reflecting very much distributed cognition, I guess. Computer-mediated distributed cognition.
So
I'm sure there are many other issues out there than the three I just mentioned.
I'm not at all surprised that you turned our Zoom interview into a data collection opportunity. And so this leads me to the next question that I'm sure is on everybody's mind, and that's, how do you stay so productive? Is it coffee? Do you not sleep? Like, what is it? Because you have so many papers that you publish and so many projects that you're managing all the time.
Yeah. Well, I may have published many papers, but certainly not all of them are so-called A+ papers. Many, in fact, most of my articles have appeared in so-called lesser journals, and I think you need that background. That said, I guess it's a nice number, and I think I'm a disciplined researcher, and I approach it in a very almost Tayloristic or Taylorized way, meaning that I literally strive to write minimum 500 words every single day, including Sundays, and I've always done this. And if you do that and you just stick to that routine and that discipline, I mean, you'll end up getting a certain output. I've never had writer's block. I work on many papers at the same time. So if I feel that I'm stuck with something, I may pass it on to a co-author, and then I can work on another project. And I guess I'm also one of those persons who really learn by writing rather than by reading. I'm a little bit ashamed to admit it, but I don't follow the journals that regularly. I don't read that many articles. I try to read all the classics, of course, but I'm not super up to date with the recent issues of the big journals, to be entirely honest.
So I have so many questions from that answer. The first one is, I noticed when I was doing a little research about you that your mother is a published author. Do you think that discipline of writing 500 words a day is coming from
I guess.
her?
Of course, you're right. That's also genetic. Yeah.
I'm just amazed. Would you advise, junior scholars and PhD students to pick up that discipline, 500 words a day?
Not necessarily 500, but I think it's a good approach that is fruitful in the long run, to try to write something every day. When you're young faculty, you may be overwhelmed by all the teaching that you have to think about, the faculty meetings, the seminars with exciting speakers and so on. And your research may very easily step into the background, unfortunately. But of course, there's the tenure clock and so on. You got to produce. And forcing yourself to write 300 words every day, investing 1.5 to 2 hours minimum every day. I think most people can do that. I mean, that guarantees that you'll get something written. If you're young faculty, perhaps the biggest challenge is to build that pipeline, which you must have. Because given rejection probabilities, given publishing lags and so on, no one can survive and be successful in academia without a pretty substantial portfolio or pipeline. And I think if you're a senior scholar and you want to publish at a reasonably high level and with reasonable regularity, you've got to have a pipeline of about, I would say, minimum 10 papers, 10 promising papers. And building that pipeline, it's just very hard work. But something like that, a daily, mindless almost routine can help you a lot. It has worked for me. I think you may be well advised to look at what really professional writers say about this. So, for example, Ernest Hemingway is someone who thought very much about the craft of writing. And he offers this kind of advice: just sit down for 3 hours every day, super concentrated, total silence, put those 400 or 500 words down on paper, leave something for the next day. So you have to, there's something you can start from, right? I was actually quite inspired by his advice. I forgot where he wrote this, but I think he has an essay on writing, which is quite profound, but also very useful, very practical.
That's wonderful advice, I think, for all of us, even some of us who aren't so junior anymore.
Right.
So the other thing I was going to ask, and you briefly touched on this, you said 10 promising papers you should have in your pipeline. So how does that translate into number of projects, right? Because not all of the projects that you start end up being promising. So how many do you typically manage? What is your optimal number that you'd like to manage? And how do you do it?
Right. I think I work at a point of time. I work on 10 different papers. And then there are probably 20 to 30 papers that are more dormant. I don't work actively on them at the moment. They may be rejects that they're on the market again, but they need to be revised before we can resubmit them and so on. Yeah, of course it's challenging. There's a lot of complexity associated with managing up to 40 papers at a time, and I don't know, potentially as many co-authors, right? But I guess I try to realize all projects that I start, and most end up being published somewhere, not necessarily in SNJ or organization science, but in lesser journals. But I'm European. I can afford to also publish in the lesser journals.
So you mentioned co-authors,
Yeah.
and I know that you have many, many co-authors. So just to think about from a PhD perspective, we're often asked, in doctoral consortiums about finding them. Do you have any advice about finding co-authors? Or how do you go about it?
Well, usually co-authors find me nowadays, I guess. But I also have this stable set of co-authors that I've worked with for many years. In these two cases, for more than 20 years. But this is a very, very important question you raised there, because co-authors who are reliable and smart and so on, they are incredible assets. And once you have identified them, you want to stick with them or to them. How should juniors do this? I think juniors just shouldn't be afraid of reaching out to senior people, right? But I think it also that due diligence may also be in order here, because not all seniors are necessarily people you may want to work with. You've heard the stories, right? There are academic sharks around, so find someone who has a good reputation. I mean, there are reputational mechanisms at work in our field, right? They are not perfect, but people do have their reputation. So make inquiries, find out, and also perhaps, of course, there are signals. If people publish a lot, they may be too busy, quite simply. They may want to help you, and they may be enthusiastic and so on, but they just don't have the time. And that's something I've seen again and again and again with junior colleagues who set up a relationship, co-authoring relationship with some senior, typically over a large geographical distance. And the senior is just too busy with his or her daily work committees and his or her own projects and so on, and forgets about the junior colleague who is in a different part of the world, right? And this can end up badly. It can end up in conflict because of misunderstandings. You know, what's a really coordination problem may become a cooperation problem, and then you have conflict. So, but don't hold back. Don't be shy. Reach out. Talk to people. Of course, it's standard advice. Attend the conferences. Listen to people's presentation. Send them your papers. Perhaps that's one way in which you can test seniors. If you send your papers to them and they actually offer useful advice, not just niceties, but say something constructive that you can build from, then they may be potential co-authors, I suppose.
So I'm going to ask you a more personal question. Do you remember how we met? Because we've been co-authoring now for a while.
No, sadly I don't.
That's okay.
That may be old age.
We actually met through Facebook.
Oh, really?
We did, yes. I had commented on a post that you had written about something about transaction cost economics, and you had asked me to send you my dissertation. And that's how our co-author relationship started.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so be on the social media.
Which you're quite active on
some of them,
as well.
Yeah.
So just another question about managing co-authors. Have you ever had to walk away from a bad co-author relationship? And if so, what kind of advice would you give about that?
Yeah, I have. I guess this is a little bit too public to share the absolute horror stories that I could share with you. But there are a few incidents, but I work with all kinds of co-author too, I guess. There's a guy who's extremely enthusiastic in the beginning, but that basically disappears for the rest of the project. And you have to do all the work. Then there's a guy who suddenly, unexpectedly, and for no good reason, reverses the author order to his advantage. They're the guys who stay incommunicado for months or years even, right? But mostly my co-author relationships have been very good. Relatively few have. In fact, I think also most of the bad ones have also not broken down. I tend to avoid, what economists would call the no trade outcome, right? Even with a very bad co-author, it's usually possible to get something done. But you know, you finish the project, you move on. You never work with this guy again. But that's, you know, there's so much asymmetric information in our field that this is unavoidable. You have to learn people's type through working with them. That's just how it is.
So let's talk a little bit about the writing process with co-authors, because, you know, the idea generation sort of sometimes naturally flows, right? But then you're writing a manuscript together and somebody's writing over other people's words. How do you manage that? How do you feel about that when your co-authors rewrite, you know, what you've written?
Very apropos.
This is a personal question because I do this to him all the time.
People who are listening may not know that you like to rewrite my stuff a great deal. And, you know, to quote Greta Thunberg, how dare you, right? No, I think you must be humble here. Most of the time, the rewrite is justified. None of us gets it right the first time. Absolutely none of us. I certainly don't, and I'm not the most lucid writer in the world either. But of course, I want to see what happened. What did you do with my beautifully crafted prose? So track changes always. That's absolutely essential, of course.
So I see a question in the chat, and we can go to questions from the audience or in the chat if we'd like, although I have a couple more to ask. But there was a question that I'm very curious how you will answer it, because it was asking about how you handle work-life balance.
Yeah. How I handle work-life balance?
How you handle work-life balance.
Well, luckily I have a wife who is good at fighting my workaholic tendencies, I guess. That's otherwise I would be working round the clock, I guess. Unless she sometimes put down her foot and says stop. Yeah, this got to end. And,
I do often recall that the only time that you're like, I'm on vacation, my wife has mandated it. Right. So.
Then I have a neighbor who is a medical professor. He's a heart specialist. And my study has a window which is facing towards the road. He'll often pass by, and sometimes he'll look at me and he'll do this, and he'll look very worried. You're working too much is the clear message. So my wife and my neighbor are the persons who help me with the work-life balance, I suppose.
So your wife also, you mentioned, is in academia. I've noticed that you co-authored with her as well.
Yeah. And
so how has that worked compared to your typical co-author experiences?
Well, strangely, it isn't that different, because we have very complementary skills. I don't know if you know the distinction. I think there was the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin who made this distinction between the hedgehog, who is the guy who knows one big thing, right, and the fox who knows many smaller things. And I'm the fox, and Kirsten is very, very much the hedgehog. She's extremely good at concentrating on one thing in a very deep way. And also she tends to approach everything with one particular analytical lens, namely the economics of property rights approach that I mentioned earlier. Actually, we are putting together a book that synthesizes our work on the economics of property rights and how it can illuminate management theory in general and strategy in particular. So it's just called the Property Rights Approach to Strategy. Should come out next year. This may be the last thing we do together, but let's see.
Is there a reason for that?
No, well, fitting to end with a sort of collected papers volume, isn't it?
So on this topic,
actually, there is a reason, because she's going to, I think she's going to retire next year, so take relatively early retirement. So that's the reason.
So that will, be the end then of your dual career situation, but you've been living that for a long time. And so I was wondering, we have many scholars with dual career situations. Do you have advice about that?
Oh God. No, I mean, our situation was really crazy. So Kirsten, my wife, she's a professor in Bergen, Norway. I'm in Copenhagen. But at one point, I was, of course, in Milano at the Università Bocconi. She was in Bergen. Our daughter was in Oxford. And we still had a house in Denmark. And the only permanent resident in the house that we kept in Denmark was actually our dog. So we would, one of us would go back to take care of the dog, or there would be a dog sitter. But that went on for about 4 years. It was challenging. It was challenging. It requires a lot of patience and adaptability. Of course, that was the main reason I had to leave what was really a very good position at Bocconi.
Okay, so I want to switch gears here for a minute and talk a little bit about your many awards. So can we start with the fact that you've been knighted by Denmark? How did that come to be? And do we have to call you Sir Nicolai Foss?
No. It doesn't come with the honor, but if you want to, you can do that. No, this honor that you mentioned is something called the Order of the Dannebrog. Dannebrog is the Danish flag, which ostensibly is the world's oldest national flag. But the order itself was started in, I believe, 1671 for originally 50 members of royal noble rank. But what it is today, it's a clever, low-cost means of honoring and rewarding servants of the modern Danish state for civil or military service. So they typically give them to high-ranking officers in the military or in the police. But there are a few professors who are rewarded every year with this distinction. But you don't have to call me sir. I don't think you even can do that. That's an English thing.
So I'll start addressing you as Sir Nicolai in my emails.
Okay, if you insist.
So you've been, honored with many other awards. Are there any of these that you're particularly proud of? I mean, there are many Best Paper Awards. I saw that, a leading newspaper had cited you as one of the most influential economists in Denmark. Are any of these particularly, meaningful as far as,
There actually is one that is particularly meaningful, and this was becoming a fellow of the Strategic Management Society. That was a big thing for me. Jay Barney gave a great, funny, and very, very generous speech, induction speech. So that was really special. And this was in Paris for the Paris SMS conference. And Paris is my favorite city. So it truly was special for that reason too.
So we've talked about your honors. We've talked about, what you're known for. Is there a paper of yours that has not received as much attention that you think is, something substantial that you would like to see receive more attention?
Yeah, it's a little bit odd, but I have a paper that has just been published. It's an SMJ paper. It's called Economizing and Strategizing. And it's with Christian Asmussen and with Kirsten, my wife, and with Peter Klein. And it is based on the distinction between economizing approaches like the RBB to strategy and strategizing approaches like the Porter positioning approach that Oliver Williamson introduced in 1999. And most people tend to think of these two ways of thinking about strategy as orthogonal, basically. But we show that they are, by means of a formal model, that there are all sorts of relations between economizing and strategizing, that therefore these two approaches interact and often interact in surprising ways. And I think the paper's message is super powerful and super important. But here's the problem. It's a modeling paper. It's a formal model, a game theoretical model. And unfortunately, it seems to be still the situation that formal model papers don't seem to be read and cited a lot in strategy. So I'm a little bit worried. I think we have a very important, powerful message, but I'm afraid that the packaging will might obscure the message. So I guess what we need to do is we need to produce a hard business review version of it or something like that. But my fear is that this paper, which actually took us 20 years to write, 20 years. So it's based on a paper that Kirsten and I wrote back in 2000 or 2001. And then we first enrolled Peter Klein in the team, then Christian Asmussen towards the end. And then finally we got it out after 20 years. So you can imagine why I would like this paper to become influential and cited and so on, but it may not, but let's see.
Okay, at this point in the time, I think we can turn to the audience to address some of your questions. We have some in chat already.
Wow.
But if people would also like to raise their hand, we could allow you to ask questions directly to Nicolai.
All right, I haven't kept track of what is happening in the chat. Should I take a look?
All right, I'll look for some of them here for you.
Okay.
So somebody asked about your 500 words per day. How much
is
writing versus rewriting? That was
this is new writing, Louisa. Rewriting doesn't count. Or writing an op-ed doesn't count. I mean, this is writing something on a new paper project.
And we also have a question from Abby here. And what did you write about today?
I wrote something in a book that Peter Klein and I are doing. This is actually a trade book, a popular book with Public Affairs Press. So the book is called The Myth of the Bossless Company, Why Managers Still Matter. And it's a critique of, you know, the bossless company narrative that people like Gary Hamel and others have been promoting for many years. And we're basically just telling managers that what they're doing, that when they're exercising the managerial authority makes sense and hierarchy makes sense and so on. So in a sense, very old-fashioned, but I think it needs to be said. That's what I did today. Then I also worked on a paper with Jens Schmidt on ecosystems, which is one of my streams. Paper with Jens Schmidt and David Tce.
So another question is, where do you get all the inspiration for the research questions for all of the papers in your pipeline?
I think it's snowballing to a large extent. Once you have a stream that you're working on, you're constantly pushing forward. You're uncovering new problems that you need to address, and that perhaps no one else has looked at. So I guess that's how it works. There are also many, if you're interested in many things and you have different streams going on, you'll probably notice relations or interdependencies or complementarities even between those themes. And you may exploit them and write a paper about that.
Okay, the next question we have is from a student. So the student is asking, is there any connection between the behavioral strategy and OB divisions? And, you know, what do you see, you know, as potential synergies there?
Right, that's a very, very good question, because you often get this, sometimes a little bit, maybe a sneering remark, right? Well, behavioral strategy, that's just OB, right? Those of us who take an interest in behavioral strategy, we've had this kind of reaction. I'm sure you have, Libby. But it's not, because behavioral strategy is using psychology insights, and of course, therefore also OB insights, to say something about something that happens typically at a higher level of analysis. Ultimately, it's using psychology to say something about competitive advantage, profitability, value creation, appropriation, and so on. So OB is, I don't know much about OB, but it's mainly a single level, right? People and groups. But behavioral strategy, in my view, should be micro-foundational, meaning there must be at least 2 levels. Got to have the firm level, the firm outcomes, and you also need to have the individual and group level there. So yes, there are, OB can inform behavioral strategy, but it's certainly not the same thing, not at all.
So I'm going to add my own question there too. TMT research, right, does have those 2 levels, but sometimes people limit behavioral strategy to just TMT, you know, psychological influences on the firm. What are your thoughts about that? Should it be broader than that?
It absolutely should be broader. To think of behavioral strategy as purely an upper echelons or higher echelons thing is just wrong. And think about work motivation, for example. So work motivation, if you happen to have employees who are particularly motivated at a high level, in a way that is beneficial to the company, say in a particular pro-social manner, that may be a strategic asset. And you will have to care about that work motivation, and you'll have to leverage it. And you'll have to put in place systems for tapping into that work motivation and maintaining it, expanding it perhaps. And that, of course, requires that you are thinking about the lower levels in the organization, about middle managers and people on the shop floor. And I think someone like Don Hambrick is very much aware of this. So he has this nice piece in AMR a few years ago where he's reflecting on his piece with Mason, and he says that one of the big problems in the current TMT stream is that there's a disconnect between what's going on at the top level and at the lower levels in the organization, research-wise. So I think he's pointing towards something what I just said.
I think, you know, I'd love to hear that answer, because I do think that there's a lot of, you know, potential opportunity there for more research.
But think about the research that we've been doing. I mean, we've been looking from a behavioral point of view at exchanges between organizational units and the frictions, the conflicts that may erupt, and how top management may have to step in and, you know, resolve these kind of issues. That's behavioral strategy as far as I can see, or behavioral transaction cost economics, if you like. But it's not something you can think meaningfully about if your sole focus is the top management team. Although, of course, obviously it goes without saying that they are super important in the equation.
Exactly. So we actually have a live question here.
All right.
Please go ahead.
Hello. Thank you very much for letting me ask a question. So I'm a really young researcher, and when I was reading about you, the most astonishing part about you was about that you were looking for a conflict in research. You were disagreeing with theories and trying to counter ideas and thoughts. What do you think about this when we look at European research culture and American research culture? How is this going to evolve in the future? And what is the importance of disagreement going to be?
A very, very good and interesting question. You know, partly I think it's a personality issue, isn't it? I mean, some people are more belligerent than other people, right? And if you're a little bit, if you seek confrontation to some extent, you know, you may want to, you may like to criticize those theories that you think should be called out, and you may write it up, and you may send it to a journal. So my first major paper, I guess, is an organization science article from '96, which is very, very critical of something called the knowledge-based view of the firm. That Jason Spender, he's here today. He's one of the representatives of that. And to put it more precisely, it was very, very critical of a particular claim in that stream of research, namely that you could explain the existence of firms without making use of the notion of opportunism. And I attacked that, and Jay Barney, who was the editor at that time, liked that critique a lot, and he accepted the paper and published it. And I think that the journals actually like conflict to some extent, or put it more nicely, disagreement, right? Because disagreement means, to some extent, it means excitement. It means more readers. It may mean more citations. It may mean that the impact factor of the journal goes up. So I don't think that you as a young researcher should necessarily shy away from say, a more conflictual approach, criticizing what is out there. But of course, you cannot just criticize. You have to bring something to the table that is your own positive contribution. But if you can do both, fine, I guess. But then you also raised the point that could there be a distinction here between the European and US research culture? Possibly, because in seminars and so on, I have noticed that US people tend to be very, very polite and nice and constructive, whereas sometimes when you get US review reports back, they kill you massively. Whereas in Europe, perhaps it's almost opposite. People are sometimes extremely aggressive and nasty in seminars. Some countries in Europe more than others, perhaps, but that's what I've noticed. But perhaps European reviewers, they are a little bit more lenient. This may be, I may be entirely wrong, but that's how I have experienced it, at least in the past. Was that the kind of response you were looking for, Yves?
Yes. So, but the very interesting part you always provide is that you not only brought into the conflict, but you had the intellect to build upon it and then change the research. So that was really nice. So thank you for answering this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. We're going to pause just a minute here because I've been notified by Zhao that we need to do a screenshot. So please turn on your cameras for just a moment so we can memorialize this interview.
And also, thank you, Libby, and also memorize the record number of attendees. So, all right, so everyone, if you could turn on your camera, we're just gonna take a screenshot, and bear with me, I need to take 2 for different frames. 1, 2, 3. Hold on. 1 and second one. 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Back to you, Libby. Thanks.
Okay, we have more questions in the chat. This might be my favorite question asked by Louise. Is the dog part of the work-life balance equation as well, or just the neighbors and your wife person?
Very much part of the equation. It's a great question, Louise. You should get a dog if you don't have one already. We should all, it wasn't directed at you in particular, we should all have a dog. They do wonderful things for you. You get out of your study or your office, you need to walk. You walk the hound at least twice per day. You have to do problem solving stuff with it. It gives you a perspective on life, it shows you that it's possible to just be totally calm and think about nothing and have a good life. They are super loyal creatures, of course, usually in a very good mood. So yeah, I can very much recommend it. The dog is very much part of the work-life balance equation for me, certainly.
And what is your dog's name, Nicolai?
My daughter named it Simba. You can guess why.
Very nice.
It's a she, so it's entirely wrong. Yeah.
My dog happens to be named after Williamson, so
is that right? Fantastic.
I was curious if you also had gone that route.
Yeah.
Okay, we have more questions. So we've talked already about your Microfoundations and what aspects do you believe should be pursued for the research, but there's also a question about your work in dynamic capabilities and what do you think is interesting research opportunities in that area.
Right. So David Tce has this paper in 2007 on the microfoundations of dynamic capabilities, which is about sensing, seizing, and what's the third aspect? Well, there's a third component of those microfoundations, right? But in that article, when he talks about the microfoundations of dynamic capabilities, what he really means is that the company has in place routines for sensing, routines for seizing, and so on. And so it doesn't, there are many microfoundations aspects that he doesn't cover, because after all, routines are not individual level, they are group level or unit level or whatever, or even organization level. That he has some later research in which he looks into top management teams and how they may support dynamic capabilities. So to what extent does, how is sensing, say, related to top management teams, and or seizing, could it have to do with fault lines in the top management teams, things like that. But I think that when David's developed with Gary Pisano and Amy Schuon the dynamic capabilities approach, what he really wanted it to be was to be like the strategic management equivalent to evolutionary economics. If you read the original paper from 1997, it's crammed with references to evolutionary economics, and it talks about complexity and change and uncertainty and dynamics and so on. And it seems to me that in terms of the microfoundations of dynamic capabilities, there's still a huge unexploited potential there. So this goes back to what I said earlier about how we cope with uncertainty being a frontier issue in behavioral strategy. I also think it's very much a frontier issue when we talk about dynamic capabilities. So how do executive teams make sense of uncertainty? What are the stories they tell? What are the beliefs they stick to? Perhaps some of those industry recipes, to use J.C. Spender's expression. So what parts of the industry recipe will have to go? What are the new parts of the way we think about our industry and our competitors and so on that we add and so on? And we just don't have good thinking about this, or good theories, and we certainly don't have a good formalism for thinking about it. What we have that is rigorous and precise and so on is Bayesian updating. But it's probabilistic. It doesn't really tell us where our priors come from in the first place. And perhaps what dynamic capabilities in highly uncertain environments are really about is, picking the right priors and then updating them in a clever way, perhaps. So I think there's still a lot we can say about the microfoundations of dynamic capabilities, particularly with respect to the sort of epistemic aspects of it.
So Russ has commented here, and Russ, you could pipe up if you'd like, about how it's strange that dynamic capabilities is disconnected with the literature and org change. Do you have thoughts on potential opportunities there, Nicolai, or why that may be?
Right. Yes, Ross is right. But on the other hand, it seems to me that dynamic capabilities, sometimes it's a label for a lot of things that are not very well connected. It's TMT research, it's strategic change, it's alliances. What we need to move forward the dynamic capabilities ideas, I think, isn't more links to related areas of fields. What I think we need, first of all, is a core theory, core theorizing, that will allow us to truly understand what dynamic capabilities are in terms of how people individually and jointly react to, make sense of, cope with uncertainty. Of course, there's more than that, because, this is mainly the sensing part of dynamic capabilities, but I happen to think that may be the most interesting part of it.
So we have another question on microfoundations of dynamic capabilities, and that's asking your opinion about the non-cognitive microfoundations. And in this question, they're bringing up the framework proposed by Nayak et al.
I don't know that paper. I can try, there's a link there.
But in general, your thoughts on non-cognitive microfoundations while you're scanning that?
So what are non-cognitive microfoundations? All right, so the way they talk about them is these sensitivities and predispositions that precede cognitive representation. These sensitivities and predispositions are typically transmitted and shared unconsciously through social practices rather than through formal instruction. Yeah, but that's interesting because it partly addresses what I talked about earlier. When we sense and when we make sense of things and form beliefs and revise beliefs, of course those beliefs and the revision process come from somewhere, right? And I think that's what they're talking about here in this paper, the antecedents of those cognitive processes. I don't know the paper, but I'll definitely study it. So many thanks for the reference.
My pictures just came up.
Yeah, it's a very recent paper. I can see that.
Okay, we have a question back to writing. So the question is, what % of time do you spend on rewriting versus rewriting every day?
It's hard to see here, but yeah, I can see them.
Probably 50-50, I guess.
Up here.
May I ask
50%,
everyone to mute, please?
50% exploration, 50% exploitation, if you like. That's the way I try to be ambidextrous.
And do you find your research to be local or is it distant?
That's definitely a competence trap. Yeah.
Okay, and looking at the chat, Michael Labline, you posted a couple of references here. Do you want to comment or do you have a question for Nicolai?
I could have a question for Nicolai. I benefit from it. This is just, I think that was an interesting conversation about dynamic capabilities. And those are two papers that came to mind that maybe wouldn't.
Thanks, Michael.
There's some on the group.
I think one of them is in your journal, isn't it?
That is true.
Yeah.
Dave Collis has written for us, and he takes a take on he goes through both the virtues and limitations of dynamic capabilities, but then also talks through the Danaher case and sort of thinking about how the organization structure as well as the cognitive tools of that management team affected their adaptation ability. I found it very similar to Gary's paper, which I had seen on the HBS website for years, and I think is a really, what's interesting about Gary's paper, which is published in ICC, is he talks a little bit about how he thinks the dynamic capabilities agenda was I think he actually uses the word hijacked, but in a way that your comments were talking about. So thank you for volunteering this time. Great to hear your voice and thoughts.
So we have a question here that's pretty specific, Nicolai. It says, do you have a particular paper and process that is rooted in G.B. Richardson? Every time I read his work, there's something newly provocative.
I actually do. So I mentioned that I'm working on something with Jens Schmidt, who some of you may know is a very, very smart young guy at Aalto University, and also with David Tce, and this is on ecosystems and on ecosystem emergence. And Jens and I have another paper also on the same topic. And Richardson's thinking is extremely relevant to this particular, very important, very topical issue of ecosystems and how ecosystems emerge. Because Richardson's central interest is really the coordination of investments, the coordination of competitive investments, the coordination over time of complementary investments, and how that is brought about. So he was a British economist, and his particular interest back in the 50s and 60s was actually competition policy. And he thought that things like price agreements and cartels and so on, things that we condemn nowadays, right? We don't like them. They were actually great things because they helped producers stabilize investment expectations. So that's what he was trying to do. But of course, we're not talking about competition policy in our work on ecosystems, but rather about how entrepreneurs can build systems of complementary and partly competitive investments, which after all business ecosystems are, right? So yes, Randy, the answer is we do have a couple of papers which I'm happy to send to you that are both rooted in the thinking of George Richardson. David Tce is one of the co-authors here, and he's also someone who has raved almost about Richardson's contributions because to some extent they anticipated Tce's own work on complementary investments in the 1986 research policy paper, which has been so super influential in our field.
Okay, we have another question back to dynamic capabilities. So aren't dynamic capabilities kind of capability for exploration, March 91, which is a challenge because of uncertainty?
Yeah, yes, there are a lot of relations between these two concepts also. But Tce also, in addition to sensing and what is it transforming, I think, which is the third microfoundation. Then there's also seizing, which is more exploitative, to use March's terms. So I guess there isn't perfect congruence between these concepts. They're not strictly speaking the same thing, but they're clearly related. It's a good question because I don't recall anyone explicitly comparing March's 91 piece and subsequent thinking on exploitation exploration to dynamic capabilities, but I'm sure Michael will know if someone has done that.
Okay, Michael.
I think that was Xavier's question, but
It was, but you unmuted,
okay.
so I'm going to give you an opportunity.
I think that was Xavier's question, but I think maybe a subset of us can get around and do that more, provide some more systematic statement about that. But
right.
I'm not sure what I would say has been. I mean, I think, yeah, my sense is there is as in so much, there's too much relabeling in our field, but yeah, there's an opportunity to see what is truly unique between the two concepts.
Right.
So Nicolai, I missed a question that I'm going to go back to.
Okay.
The question is if you have any suggestions to early stage researchers who are sympathetic to the Austrian school, so the non-interventionist agenda and highly conservative in proposing policy implications, when working with co-authors, not selected by themselves, who are used to following the Keynes approach.
Oh, wow.
Particularly in the UK. So this is a very specific question for you.
Indeed, it's extremely specific. So I think it's about how do you manage co-authorship? Co-authorships when there's a substantial amount of political disagreement in the team. Isn't that the question? Yes.
It seems to be.
Politics is too. Forget about politics. Is my advice. No, I don't care about the politics of my co-authors at all. I couldn't care less, literally. Don't let it poison your hopefully good co-authorships, co-authorship relations. So.
Okay, we have another question. Would you like? Whoops! It just flipped over there. Would you like to share your thoughts about the current discussions on the purpose of corporation?
The purpose of the corporation? I don't see the. Right.
It's a question from Chao Chen.
Right. Well, I guess I'm actually pretty sympathetic to Friedman's original message, which I think has been badly misunderstood. Friedman was not against philanthropy at all. What he was specifically criticizing in that little 4-pager in, was it New York Times back in 1970, was owners using corporate funds without getting the express permission of the owners. But if the owners were okay with the managers doing CSR and so on, Friedman would be perfectly fine with it also. So what he really was talking about, he didn't use those words, but he was talking about a principal agent problem, and that was his main concern, and that's why he argued that the main responsibility of a company is to maximize profits. But I think you can say much more in favor of having super simple corporate objectives. I mean, you can have all sorts of very nice objectives, but the actual management challenges of aligning all those many different objectives, you have stakeholder groups with very different interests. How do you exactly align those interests? The great advantage of having one stakeholder group, namely the shareholders, more or less in charge, is that it's relatively easy to coordinate actions between them because they have the same objective, namely maximize profits. Right? So I certainly believe there is a role in the economy for cooperatives and also for firms with more than one objective and so on, but there are just situations where it makes perfect sense to have ownership by shareholders and the pursuit of good old-fashioned traditional profit maximization. That said, I also recognize that having say pro-social corporate missions may make a lot of sense, but they may make a lot of sense because they feed into profitability. It's pretty banal, but this is something that I've explored with Sigvard Lindenberg and Julian Birkinshaw, namely that having pro-social missions and pursuing these nice things and so on may have nice spillover effects on employee motivation, for example.
Okay, I encourage you all to think of some questions because we still have about 15 minutes and we have this rare opportunity to get to pick Nicolai's brain here, and we've run out of them in the chat. I have another question for you just in general, Nicolai. So a lot of the advice that we've been asking you about have been for more junior researchers. But what about your advice to associate researchers? So we're finally past the tenure hurdle, but now we're getting a lot more demands on our time. So how would you advise an associate as far as being successful and reaching that next level and remaining productive?
Well, I think it's very, very important to be able to say no. You don't need to invest all your time in service, for example. I think some people substitute too much towards service, for example, and they're just too generous with their time. That's a very nice book by Adam Grant, in which he looks at basically the relation between pro-social behavior and individual performance. And it's an inverted view, right? So if you're totally non-pro-social, it's going to harm you. But if you're too pro-social, if you do too much service, that's going to harm you too. So very simple advice, I would say, super hands-on, do maximum 1 journal review per month, for example. You don't need to attend all seminars in your department, but you certainly need to attend every second, I would say, particularly those of more junior colleagues. don't accept all seminar invitations. Be very picky, I guess. Occasionally skip one of the big conferences, because it's nice to attend the Academy of Management annual conference, or the Strategic Management Society conference, or the Academy of International Business, but surely you don't need to attend all 3 in a year. Perhaps one is sufficient, because I mean it's basically, particularly for us in Europe, going to the US for an AOM. I mean, it's a week invested, plus all the preparation, easily 2 more weeks. That's a lot of research time that you're burning there. So yeah, I think it's very simple and low practical. Keep your pipeline in order, set up you manage it through some kind of Excel file or similar, or have a big table in your office with your projects, so that your colleagues you can mobilize the invisible social forces in that way, right? Your colleagues come into your office and, well, you're still working on that project. Right.
So we have a couple of more questions here. One from Tim. What did you learn from your time at Bocconi? That's a great question.
I learned some Italian, to be sure. No, this was it was a super well-organized university, extremely smoothly running machine, very professional in its approach at all levels. It was actually nice to come back to CBS and to notice that CBS, in the meantime, had caught up a great deal. Because when I went from CBS to Bocconi, I was shocked by the sheer professionalism at all levels, literally. But you know, CBS has been very good at catching up in the meantime, so that was extremely pleasant to experience. There were some fantastic colleagues there. Alfonso Gambardella, you all know him. Arnoldo Camufo, Claudio Panico, Carlos Salvato, great scholars, great friends. I'm still co-authoring with some of them. I would very much like to go back and visit Bocconi again this fall when the whole COVID situation clears up a bit. But you know, I didn't learn anything specific. It was just a very good European environment, one of the best, to be sure.
Okay, we have another question. This is back to Microfoundations from Daniel Raff. So the thrust of the Microfoundations impulse, the summer of the 3 conferences about it, seemed to be reductionist, that there were no organizational level phenomena which had any existence aside from the behavior of individuals. Was this impression correct? Do you still believe this?
So this is the whole supervenience discussion. The Microfoundations claim is that all aggregate phenomena, all organization level phenomena can be reduced to the actions and interactions of individuals. That's what it says. And then more normatively, that for management research to progress, it should be reduced in this way. So yes, it is reductionist. It is reductionist. But it's not saying, Daniel, that aggregates have no role in explanation. So if you look at the basic Coleman bathtub, you know, the familiar boat figure, Coleman basically starts up in the north western corner with collectives, with what sociologists would call social facts, right? That's in a sense, that's the starting point. Of course, he would also argue that those social facts can be reduced to individuals and their interactions. But in a sense, it begins from aggregates. The basic claim is that there are no, my interpretation of Microfoundation is that there is no macro causality. There's no macro variable A that literally causes another macro variable B. It's all mediated through micro. That's the claim, I think. So I don't see it as particularly controversial, actually.
So here's an interesting question, and one that I'm interested in hearing your answer to. So what is the exciting work being done in TCE these days? Other than you, who is doing the work?
Yeah. Wow. That's Jackson. Jackson Nicholson he's been pushing the boundaries of TCE right from the start of his career. And it's very funny because for a long time Jackson was thought of as the most orthodox TCE guy around, even more orthodox than the Pope himself, Williamson. But in actuality, already in his doctoral dissertation, he was doing very, very innovative TCE work, going much beyond application and really pushing the boundaries of TCE. And of course, the problem-solving approach is very much about this. Then there's Libby's work on say framing of exchanges in relations between companies, and our work on framing of transactions within companies, and comparison biases between units and employees in corporate hierarchies, and so on. What else is there? Yeah, that's what comes immediately to mind as the exciting work. But of course, much of Jackson's work on the problem-solving stuff has been around since 2004. But I think it could and should be more recognized than it is, because it's quite important work.
So you and I have discussed that there seems to be a decline in using that perspective. Why do you think that is, and how do you think it could be revived?
That's interesting. When I started going to the Academy of Management conferences, this is the end of the 1990s, around 2000 basically, at least in the business policy and strategy division, it was TCE, 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 and TCE again. Almost a majority of the sessions, at least that's how I remember it, had some TCE content. But I don't really see that to the same extent nowadays. There's very little TCE work that is being presented. But perhaps it's an effect of many things. I mean, 20 years ago, economics was still the dominant discipline in strategy, to be sure. But since then, psychology has become much more influential via behavioral strategy and so on. Sociology has become enormously influential in strategy also. And perhaps, economics perspectives have been a little bit squeezed, and TCE in particular may have become, been there, done that-ish, right? But at least the paper that we hopefully will get out soon, Libby, is basically saying, hey, there are many, many things, even in traditional TCE, that we still don't know about. So to exemplify, what are really the causes of hierarchical failure, for example? I mean, this is still something which is very ill understood in transaction cost economics, which is strange, because transaction cost economics is fundamentally comparative. So we compare the way transactions are organized in markets, hybrids, and hierarchies, which means that you've got to understand the cost and benefits of those alternative governance structures. And you actually have a problem if you don't fully understand the cost, the potential failures of one of those governance structures, namely hierarchy. And at least that's what Libby and I argue in this paper that I'm talking about here. We haven't really understood those failures very well. And of course, we try to construct a little story that illuminates those failures and what can be done about it. So still a lot to do, but I think it has become too mainstream in a sense. It's a little bit like resource dependency theory, for example. Also a theory that was enjoyed a lot of general support and has become widely accepted, but you don't see it much used anymore. Almost like bypassed, been there, done that.
Okay, we have another question here. What are the 2 to 3 most interesting fields for future research and business model innovation for you?
I can't see the question. Could you repeat, please?
Sure. It's what are the 2 to 3 most interesting fields for future research in business model innovation?
Yeah, I think empirical work in this area is very badly needed. It's a fascinating concept. Managers like it. It resonates with them. But you don't see a lot of serious business model research in the top journals. There is some, of course, Rafi and Meet and so on. Why? Well, because theory is pushing, or if you want to call it theory is pushing ahead of empirics in this area. So I think we need much more serious work on business models. And we don't really have measurement scales for measuring business models and business model components and relations between components in a business model. I'm not sure how I would measure things like the revenue model, for example. Is there a measurement scale for the revenue model? I don't think so. So before we can really make progress in this field, we need to have good empirical. Before we can make empirical progress, I think we need strong measurement scales. Of course, there's also a lot of conceptual work to be done here. Understanding better relations of complementarity between different components in a business model. Understanding how a top management team thinks about its business model and how diverse, say, functional, educational backgrounds of top managers influence how they think about the business model. How, say, conflict in a top management team may influence the implementation of a business model, the perception of business models, and so on. There's still a lot to be done here, but I think that first and foremost, in order to make the important concept of business models more respectable, I think we need really subtle AMJ kind of empirical work on the subject.
Okay, in our last couple of minutes, we actually have some fun questions for you. So the first one is, what is your favorite city? I think I heard you mention Paris.
It's Paris, hands down.
So why? Why Paris?
Well, maybe because Kirsten and I lived there when our daughter was very, very small for 6 months. It was a great experience, and we were living in the heart of Paris and enjoying the city. So perhaps it's, those sentiments are called forth by visiting the city, but it's just so unbelievably beautiful.
And the next question is, what's your favorite dessert?
Oh, crème brûlée, of course, French dessert.
And then the last one is, what are your favorite hobbies?
Well, it is. I'm not going to play it.
Oh, I was just going to ask you to play a little something for us.
No, certainly not without preparation. This is my nice Gibson ES 175 archtop jazz guitar, which I try to play bebop jazz on. It's a little bit like research. It's ill understood by most people, and it's quite difficult and challenging.
And is jazz then your favorite genre of music?
No, I'm pretty eclectic, but I mainly listen to classical and jazz, yes.
Okay. Well, I think we're close to our time here. So I just wanted to give you a few minutes to have a few last words, if you'd like, Nicolai.
Well, I think I've said enough, basically. So let's just stop here. It's been a pleasure. And very good, funny questions also.
Well, I want to thank you all.
Great to see so many familiar faces that I haven't been able to see because of the stupid COVID situation. I hope to interact with many of you soon in the future.
And I want to thank you all for giving us this opportunity, to interview Nicolai. I don't know if you know Nicolai, but many people ask me what it's like to work with you. And it's always very curious. And I think you pulled back the curtain a little bit here to how funny and interesting you are and how thoughtful you are when we're working together. So thank you all for this lovely opportunity. And thank you, Nicolai, for your really, really thoughtful answers to these questions.
Thanks a lot all.